This is Joe Tucker, President of the International Academy of Trial Lawyers, and welcome to our podcast, The Rule of Law, The Academy Speaks. Today, we have a big fish with us. We have fellow Doug Jones, Senator from the great state of Alabama, or former Senator. Senator, I'm happy to have you here. You have a great history. We are fortunate to have you in the Academy. You're now in private practice and you're doing the tough work out there in private practice. One of the things that many of our listeners know about, and I just want to briefly talk about, is before you became a U.S. Senator, you were a U.S. attorney and you prosecuted one of the most significant civil rights cases ever to be prosecuted sometime after the initial incident. And that's the Birmingham Street bombing on 16th Street in Birmingham, Alabama, that happened in the 1960s. Catch our listeners up who aren't familiar with your prosecution of that and what happened then.
Yeah, well, thanks, Joe. And first of all, thanks for having me on this. I'm really honored to have you, and but I'm especially honored to be a part of the Academy. It's just an amazing organization, and I appreciate how you, in particular, in the organization, is standing up for the rule of law right now and for lawyers at a time that we are under such attack across this country. You know, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church happened in 1963. I was 9 years old. It was a very difficult time in Birmingham. And while most people believe, and there was some evidence that the FBI and local law enforcement pretty much had a good idea who did that bombing, it killed. They pursued it, but they could never bring anybody to justice. They could never bring anybody to trial. It was one of those kind of things that languished for a little bit. In 1977, Bill Baxley, who I think is also a member of the Academy,
Yes.
prosecuted. He was Alabama's Attorney General. He prosecuted the first guy. And then 24 years later, as United States Attorney, I was able to gather a team of extraordinary lawyers and investigators, and we pieced together enough evidence to convict two individuals, Bobby Frank Cherry and Tommy Blanton, for the murder of those four young girls, finally bringing some justice, not closure, but certainly justice to this community and to the families of the four little girls. It was really the case of a lifetime.
On behalf of all Americans to Senator Jones, we appreciate you for making sure that justice delayed was not justice denied. In that 16th Street Church litigation or prosecution, what did you learn about justice, accountability, and persistence that you can share with our listeners?
You know, it's almost self-evident there, Joe. I mean, you kind of said it, and in the sense that you learn that justice delayed does not have to be justice denied. You know, there's often injustice in delay, but at the end of the day, you know, as lawyers, as a prosecutor, as a sworn United States attorney sworn to uphold the Constitution and the law, justice can come at any point. And we felt very strong about this case, not only from a historical perspective, but from a victim's perspective. The church was a victim. The children and the families were all victims. And I think as prosecutors, we owed a duty to that community. We owed a duty to the members of that church and to the members of those families and the four little girls. And, you know, time was on our side, actually. People wondered why the case took so long, even though, quite frankly, the FBI did a phenomenal job. They take some hits for it, but they really did a great job. But not every homicide case can be solved. And it took some time for, I think, juries to have open minds. I mean, this case could not have been won, I don't think, in the 1960s because of the bias and the prejudices of the juries. And so what we found and what we learned is that it's really never, ever too late to seek the truth, to seek justice. And that in this case, it involved a very historic case that really turned the tide of civil rights in this country. But we have clients every day that it matters just as much for. And our system is built such that we should constantly be seeking that truth no matter how long it takes.
Now, from that, you talked about the collaboration with you and the FBI and how the prosecution couldn't have happened in the 1960s. Let's sort of bring this up to today where we're having, I believe we'd all agree, there's a division in America. Red, blue, liberal, conservative, pro MAGA, anti MAGA. Can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of unity and bipartisan collaboration, even from your time when you were a U.S. Senator?
Look, I always believe, and I've believed for many years. Right after law school, I worked as a Senate staffer for Senator Heflin from Alabama on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I saw Senator Kennedy, who was the chairman, working in collaboration with Strom Thurmond, of former Klansmen, segregationists from South Carolina. But by the 1980s, they were working together on any number of things. And I was able to see people on both sides of the aisle reaching out, talking about trying to find common ground because that was their job. It wasn't up, they weren't put up there, they weren't elected to be my way or the highway. They had their firm beliefs, but they also would be able to sit down with someone and try to stand in their shoes a little bit and talk about what's important to their colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And so that's where I kind of saw this happen, and I saw the results, and I saw good things that can come out of that. And I think it's really very important today that we try to get back to that. It's going to be very difficult.
Well, not very deep. What is causing such, from your perspective, and having been there where the sausage has been made, what is causing this great divide that is going on right now between one side and the other side, and between red and blue America? How can we get back to there?
Joe, it's a great question, and this just didn't happen overnight. It's been a long time coming. And there's probably a lot of things I think historians and academics and political folks will point to. From my perspective, I really believe a lot of this deals with gerrymandering, political gerrymandering on both sides of the aisle. You do that in Congress, and you do that in the state houses and legislatures. And when you do that, you've got people running in these offices that if they win a nomination, be it Republican or Democrat, they're going to get elected in November. The primary is essentially the name of the game. Primary is essentially electing the representative, no matter whether it's the state or the Congress. And when that happens, the candidates only have to appeal to a relatively small number of people, percentage-wise, in their district or their Senate or House district. Only a small number, and usually that's the most activists, the far right or the far left. And when that happens and they get elected in November, then they really don't have incentive to reach out. They just have to appeal to that base. And I think that that's been a very significant problem that has built up over the years. In 2026, we may see only 10 or 15, as much as 20 at the most, really competitive U.S. House of Representative seats where it could go either way. That's not good for our political discourse. People need to be competing for votes. And competing across the board from one end of the spectrum to the other. They need to be competing for those votes to where when they get elected, they truly are representative of a majority of the people in the district.
Well, let me push back on that just a little bit. There's a groundswell of people who have been saying that Congress, though, is not doing its job as far as checks and balances
Sure.
with the executive branch. What is Congress's failure in that regard?
Well, let's think about this. Right now, we've got a president who is pretty much on one extreme of the Republican Party, on the right. And when you've got a gerrymandered Republican majority, that majority has been elected on the coattails of the president. And if you're that gerrymandered, then the president can have such sway over whether or not you retain your job or not. There is not enough profiles and courage in the House or the Senate these days, Joe, to stand up and to do what they know would be the right thing. Instead,
That's what's upsetting, though,
of course it
Senator, that
is.
you talk about profiles and courage. And Senator Tester talked about this too when I spoke with him. he said that they're more concerned about their jobs than they are about doing the right thing.
No question. There is absolutely no question. That, again, I believe is a byproduct primarily of gerrymandering. When they appeal to those folks, they don't, and they get into Congress. Remember, they get into Congress and they only have to appeal to a certain segment of their district. And that's what they want to do. And you get in there and you get caught up in it and you want to get reelected and get reelected and get reelected. And nobody, at least right now, is willing to stand up and to do the right things and to have the kind of oversight over this administration. They are just rolling over right now. That is not what I saw when I was a young staffer in the United States Senate. Democrats were in the majority, but they did significant oversight of the Carter administration. You saw Democrats doing that with the Reagan administration. You saw Democrats doing that with the Obama administration. Right now, there is virtually no oversight at all that is going on in this administration. And it's going to take the House of Representatives flipping to Democrats. And Joe, I got to say this because we talked about bipartisanship. Democrats don't need to overreact if they get control of the House. They need to do their job, but they don't need to go off on tangents and do things just for political grandstanding. To do their job and to do the oversight, they got a hell of a lot they can work with right there if they just stick to it. But we got to win that House first.
Now, as both an attorney, U.S. Senator, you have a unique perspective on the intersection of law and politics. What reforms, I'm switching gears now, do you think need to happen to better protect the rule of law in America? Because that's what this podcast is about, that it is in protecting the rule of law and informing people on what the rule of law means and what happens when the rule of law is attacked and when judges are attacked.
People, I think out there, academics would point to wanting to either expand the court, the Supreme Court, give term limits to the court, things of that nature.
I have to stop you for a second to give a shout out to you for helping shepherd Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first African American woman Supreme Court justice, into the Supreme Court. Thank you for that. Apologize for interrupting you.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
Look, anytime, anybody can always interrupt me to talk about Ketanji Brown Jackson. That was just an incredible event. She is a force and is going to be one of the most significant justices I think history will record when her time is finished. And hopefully that's going to be a long, long time from now. But, you know, I really believe that the reforms have to be somewhat political. And we have to get folks that are recognizing what this Constitution is. You know, the Law Day theme this past Law Day, May 1st was Law Day, was, you know, the Constitution's promise, out of many, one. But and it talks about diversity, it talks about equality, it talks about freedoms. But the Constitution is a guide. It is simply a guide. The Constitution cannot be enforced by itself. It has to rely on lawyers, it has to rely on judges, it has to rely on public officials, and quite frankly, it has to rely on the citizens to also demand the things that the Constitution enshrines, like the Bill of Rights, like civil liberties, all of those things that we're talking about. So where I think that we've got to work is that we've got to figure out a way that politically people can understand that we have to have more dialogues and not monologues, and that we can get back and have a basic understanding of the facts. You know, you remember last year, Joe, I gave the speech about finding truth in an untruthful world.
Yes.
It's very, very difficult right now to.
Well, go ahead. I was gonna talk about that, but you've led into it. So go ahead and talk about that a little bit, Senator.
I think there is so much misinformation out there. I think it comes from public officials, it comes from foreign adversaries, which is still a real problem, and it's put on mediums where it appears to be factual. And it's getting worse. I mean, and unfortunately, I think this administration is making it worse because they are taking down the guardrails for social media, for other things, in which truth and facts are paramount. And that's going to be the challenge, I think, going forward. I'd like to see those guardrails back up. I'd like to make sure that Congress and others put some guardrails up that doesn't inhibit freedom of speech. Not at all. You can still have guardrails and not inhibit the First Amendment. But we've got to be able to do something that when people see something on their phones or their computers, that they have some semblance of reliability, that it is factual. And I'm not talking about political spin. I'm talking about outright lies, things that are designed to really sway people in ways that is not healthy for this country in the United States of America.
What is our role as lawyers in doing and fighting against that type of misinformation?
I think the lawyers have a very special role, and that's to stand up, to speak out, to represent clients, in even those clients that you may disagree with. Sometimes you have to represent those clients and put their best advocacy forward. That's one way of doing it. But I think right now, our legal profession has been under attack. We have had this administration that has been attacking law firms, and they have said, the president has issued an executive order that he would ask the attorney general to go after individual lawyers with sanctions if they oppose the administration's agenda. I think we're duty bound to stand up to that. I think we're duty bound to protect other lawyers, protect the rule of law, and importantly, Joe, protect judges. You and I have had enough trials in our day that we don't
Well,
always.
that's I want to talk about that specifically, the attacks that have been going on against the judiciary. That is an important topic.
It absolutely is. An independent judiciary is such a fundamental piece of the American democracy, of the Constitution. And when you start attacking those judges based on their rulings, that independence is going to be called into question. And we've got a real problem in this country now, because it appears that the president is going to attack any judge or justice that doesn't rule in his favor. If they rule in his favor, they're great. They're salt of the earth.
Yeah.
But if they don't, he's going to attack them. And I'm going to tell you, that's not only a danger for the independence of the judiciary, it's a danger to the lives of those members of the judiciary. As a lawyer, I've tried to help with some bills to protect judges more. We have to have more protection of judges. And Joe, it's not just the right that does these attacks. You saw attacks, threats to Justice Kavanaugh. It's
Yes.
incredible right now. And we've got to try to figure out ways to dial that back. We've got to have confidence in our judiciary, even if we don't agree with the decisions. We've got to have confidence in the judiciary. And I will say this, I think the judiciary has a role in helping create that confidence.
Well, talk to us about that, because polls have talked about the regard that the judiciary is currently being held, and as well as the Supreme Court. Because judges can't speak out, they can only speak through their opinions. Sometimes they will lecture, but what advice would you give judges to help better bring the prestige of the bench and the judiciary to a higher level where it's more respected in the country?
Yeah, look, I think unfortunately there are a relatively small number of judges that is creating a lot of this problem. I don't think it's just the judiciary, and I don't want anybody to think that I'm blaming just the judges on this. I think that it's a combination of things. For instance, every time you see a court ruling, especially if it comes from the Supreme Court, or anything that might be injunctive relief or something involving the administration's policy, the first thing that the media says is it was issued by a judge that was appointed by President X. Well, that right there tells you that the media is drawing a line. That if it was one president, they should do something one way. If it was a different president, a different way. And that's not the case. And we shouldn't be dividing our judges by Republicans and Democrats in our federal court system because that's not the way the system was designed. That's number one. I think we as lawyers have that, we fall into that trap a little bit. Judges, I think one of the biggest problems that we've seen with the judiciary as a whole always stems from the Supreme Court. And the Senate bears some responsibility because the U.S. Senate has so politicized the appointment of Supreme Court justices. You go back for decades, and Ketanji Brown Jackson only got 3 Republican votes. In a different time, in a different place, she would have gotten 90 plus. She could have been unanimous because she was that well qualified and that articulate in her beliefs and her judicial philosophy. But she only got 3 because of the politics. And you could just see from the hearing how politically motivated all of that was. I think judges also have a responsibility
Well,
to,
I blame that on the senators and not necessarily
oh,
the
100,
judges who are sitting
100%.
there.
100%. I've laughed and I've told people that, we could probably help that Supreme Court confirmation process the best if we pass some kind of a law or amendment that would prohibit members of the Senate Judiciary Committee from ever running for president. Because when those bright lights hit, man, they start to perform.
Yeah,
So
it's a show.
it's a show. It's a
It is
show.
almost embarrassing the nature of some of the questions that senators ask these justices.
Absolutely. And Joe, for the judge's standpoint, I think they've got to be above reproach. We have
Hmm.
seen we have seen serious questions about judicial ethics coming from the highest judges in this land. We have seen some pretty serious political questions coming from some of the highest judges in the land. And as you said, judges can do things through their opinions, but they have to be very careful, both in their personal life as well as their opinions, to try to not show that partisan nature. And that's unfortunate that I think we've seen it a little bit more. And sometimes we have seen judges, and this is really not new. It's happened throughout history where a judge has a political ideology and
Yes.
they have an answer to whatever issue is before them, and they know how they want that answered, and they'll find a way to get there, as opposed to simply following the law and the facts and getting to the conclusion that it should have gotten. And again, I want to emphasize this. From my perspective, I think overwhelmingly our judiciary, at least the federal judiciary, and that's the one I'm most familiar with, is overwhelmingly, I think they try to do the right thing. They try to uphold that independence. They do their best to try to follow the rule of law and interpret the law as they see it. That may be different than what I agree with, but at least I know they're intellectually honest about it, and it's exactly how the Constitution was set up. I think they've got a responsibility to continue to do that and not try to mold something to fit an outcome which they so desire.
Senator, I often ask my guest here, and I want to end with this question. What gives you hope in today's current political environment where you have these extremes and it seems as though hatred is winning the day and distrust is the beginning of the morning for us?
Joe, I get asked that a lot, and my answer probably varies from different things. But at the end of the day, what gives me hope is history and the American people. We have gone through difficult times before. We went through a civil war, for God's sakes. And there was hate in the air. There were killings left and right. I mean, hundreds of thousands of young men died in the Civil War. We went through Jim Crow. We went through the Civil Rights Movement. We went through the anti-war movement. We've gone through so many things. We went through violence on the left back in the late 60s and early 70s, and we see more violence on the right now. I have hope because at some point, I think the American people cherish this country and they cherish the rule of law. They cherish democracy more than they are an absolute whatever, more so than their admiration, more so than their adherence to a political ideology or a political person. I think that they care about this. And what gives me hope is what I see around the country all the time, where people are starting to question, they're starting to look, and they want people to talk to each other, not at each other. And I think that the hope lies in the American people, and particularly young people. That's what gives me hopes. We've got some choppy waters ahead of us, Joe. We still do. This fever we've got is not going to break anytime soon, but I have confidence it's going to break. And when it starts, just that one ripple in the pond is going to spread out, and it's going to hit all the members of Congress. And all of a sudden, some of those profiles and courage. It doesn't take very much. And I think we're starting to see that. I'll give you a good for instance. Just yesterday, Tom Tillis, Republican from North Carolina, on the Senate Judiciary Committee, came out and advised the White House that he was going to oppose the nomination of Ed Martin to be the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. And you know, my history as U.S. Attorney, it's a very almost sacred office for me. And this guy was so bad. He was
offensive, as a matter of fact.
He was offensive to the lawyers. He was offensive because he honored Nazi sympathizers. But it took Tom Tillis is going to be in a tough reelect, and it took some courage for Tom to do that. And I appreciate that so much. And I saw just today, the president withdrew his nomination because it created that groundswell. And I think we're going to see that more and more as time goes on. And we're going to see more and more pushback on violations of due process and violations of the rule of law. And countries are going to do it on a lot of these tariffs. So at the end of the day, our elected officials, our leaders, the American people and the electorate, that's what has to give you hope, because that's who we are as a people, I believe.
Well, Senator Jones, I want to thank you for taking some time to talk to me today. We appreciate it. And to my listeners, if you like what you have heard today, subscribe. You can find this wherever you get podcasts, whether it's Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube. Thank you for listening to The Rule of Law, The Academy Speaks. I'm Joe Tucker, President of the Academy, and I'll see you guys next week.